All right, y'all, what is up, my A-Push peeps? Welcome to week 14 of our second semester, and fortunately, our second to last week of content to cover for our A-Push curriculum. For today, we're going to focus on a slight pivot from what we did in our live session. Our live session focuses on the causes of the rise of conservatism in the late 60s and early 70s. So we talked then, and we'll talk then about Nixon's domestic events and some of the domestic factors that get us to a place in which our society kind of pivots from an era of liberalism and liberal policies more back towards more conservatism. And when I say conservatism, broadly speaking, what that usually means is a smaller federal government, more states' rights, less intervention into people's day-to-day lives via either regulation or restrictions or federal guarantees for things, right? So if you think about, like, for the majority of the 20th century, we talked about things that we can consider more progressive policies, like the progressive era, right? More government intervention. The 1920s, of course, being the exception, but the New Deal, even Truman using the federal government for school integration, for military integration, Eisenhower as well, same thing, Kennedy, LBJ, Great Society, all examples of liberal policies, progressive policies. And we're going to take a step back from that here in the 1970s, then in the 1980s, okay? So today's title is called Nixon and Carter's 1970s, Stagflation, Disillusionment, and Lost Trust. The lost trust piece is key, because if we're going to ask our federal government to do more things, to be more involved, that comes with a trust, right? If you're going to ask somebody to do something for you, you want to trust them. And I think this disillusionment, this lack of belief in the federal government is one of the reasons why Americans increasingly turn towards a more conservative approach with less government for a variety of reasons, but one reason being that they don't trust the government anymore. So 1968, as we talked about in our live session, elects Richard Nixon. Richard Nixon as the Republican, for the first Republican president since Eisenhower in the 1950s. He runs against Hubert Humphrey, who of course was President LBJ's vice president there in the 1960s. You know, a little pointer for you. There we go. He runs against Hubert Humphrey. The Democratic Party convention is split, right, between more liberal Democrats, more moderate Democrats. It's this one of the reasons why Nixon gets elected is this split in the Democratic electorate. We also see here on this map a really important piece, right? An area that we can consider historically Democrat. Votes for neither the Democrats or the Republicans. They vote for George Wallace, that same guy who you watched a video clip of last week in his Georgia governor inaugural address, saying segregation today, segregation tomorrow, segregation forever. Right. So as we're seeing the Democratic Party kind of break up, as the Southern Democrats are no longer identifying with the Democratic Party for a variety of reasons, one of which is the Democrats' embrace of civil rights in the 1960s. They're not quite ready to necessarily be Republican if there's a states' rights non-integrationist candidate available, which there is George Wallace in this case. But because of this split, Richard Nixon wins. Richard Nixon runs for president on a law and order approach, much the way we saw out of Donald Trump in 2016 and 2020. This idea that the country is crumbling and we need a strong reinforcement of the law and order and stability. And I'm the guy to do it, to go back to reinforcing stable, traditional American life. This is in reflection, obviously, in reaction to a lot of the chaos of the 1960s, right? The urban unrest in Watts, Detroit, and elsewhere. Newark, New Jersey has a big example of urban unrest, well, largely in response to societal factors and police brutality. But also 1968, right? The assassinations that all take place in 1968, the way the Vietnam War is kind of falling apart in 1968. So Richard Nixon is looked at as the law and order, stability, return to conservatism type of candidate there in 1968. Now, talking about Nixon's Cold War, Nixon's foreign policy approach, he's going to embrace a policy that becomes known as détente. Détente which means to lessen the tensions, to ease the stress of the Cold War. We talked about the 1960s, of course, with the Cuban Missile Crisis and Vietnam and elsewhere, that things are quite tense, and Nixon's aim is to reduce those tensions, to turn down the heat a little bit on the Cold War. And he does this by engaging in dialogue, engaging in summits. engaging what he calls the madman theory, right? Which is like if the Vietnamese and the communists in China and the Soviet Union all believe that I'm like this crazy anti-communist radical, they're more likely to deal with me diplomatically than want to deal with me militarily. In this case, it's kind of like a psychotic version of Eisenhower's brinksmanship, which we talked about a couple weeks ago. Now, his broader foreign policy is called the Nixon Doctrine, right? Much like the Truman Doctrine was, or the Eisenhower Doctrine. The Nixon Doctrine is going to say basically that we will pay for you to fight communism. We will give you materials to fight the expansion of communism, but we're no longer sending our troops to fight the expansion of communism. This is a lesson learned, of course, from Vietnam, which started with like tanks and dollars and then transitioned into troops when it was needed to shore up the South Vietnamese. We can go back and forth on whether or not that was a good decision or not. But the Nixon Doctrine is going to try to bring U.S. soldiers home, reduce U.S. casualties in the Cold War, but still be willing to support anti-communist efforts economically and with resources. Nixon also exploits the divide between the Chinese and the Soviet Union in a pretty impactful way by making it a point to meet individually with both of them. Nixon is the first president to recognize and meet with China since the revolution. After World War II, he meets with Chairman Mao in February of '72. And that then puts the pressure on the Soviet Union, right, to ensure that they're not left behind in this global superpower conversation. It pressures the Soviet Union to engage in détente as well, right, to avoid stronger Chinese or Sino-American relations. So we see Nixon playing chess here, so to speak, on the global political sphere. And this is also quite popular. Americans really like the fact that Nixon does this, that he goes to China, meets with Chairman Mao, right? And it demonstrates this new era of American foreign policy. He also then, a few months later, visits the Soviet Union. He has a summit in Moscow with the leader of the Soviet Union, Brezhnev. And it's there that they decide to agree to a really significant, really impactful treaty, SALT I, which of course will apply. There'll be more SALTs. SALT I, the Strategic Arms Limitation Treaty, right? This real attempt to slow down the arms race between the two powers. What this did was freeze where it was the existing ballistic missile launchers, the ICBMs we talked about, and the launchers that spread them, these missiles that use satellites, right, to shoot up in the air, and you can shoot anywhere from the world. It's crazy. I don't understand these things. But to reduce the buildup of these and to reduce the existing amount of missiles that are there, as well as signing a treaty in which they're going to stop pursuing new ways to kill each other, so to speak. So détente, in a sense, works quite well with the Chinese, with the Soviet Unions, so much so that we give Nixon a lot of credit for his Cold War foreign policy in engaging in these types of diplomatic conversations with both. Now in Vietnam, Vietnam is a slightly different story. Now Vietnam is, of course, the hottest issue in American foreign policy. Domestic policies, a lot of others talked about, like civil rights, Great Society, war on poverty, the counterculture, all the unrest in the 60s. But on foreign policy, the big issue when Nixon is elected in 1960s is Vietnam. Now in Vietnam, he promises when he runs for president what he calls peace with honor, right? Nobody knows what the hell that means, but that's what he promises, that we're gonna have peace and we're gonna be honorable about it, which to me means that we're not gonna lose this war, but we're not gonna win this war. We're gonna find an honorable peace that lets us get out without it being embarrassing, right? The honor piece is important there. In this campaign, he's appealing to what he calls Nixon's silent majority. It's an important element of his political support. I think it's important that you understand, like, this phrasing is key, right? Silent and majority, which implies the opposite being a loud minority. So putting this in the context of the 1960s, it's important that we think about this as, in some ways, a backhanded insult to the anti-war protesters, right? They're loud, but he's saying they're a minority. The civil rights demonstrators, right? The counterculture, they're loud, but they're a minority in Nixon's vernacular. Now, it's successful. He gets elected, obviously, but it's important to understand that silent majority as a way to better understand the social divide of the 1960s and 70s, right? On one hand, you have the people that are loud in the streets and protesting, but on the other hand, people that are not, but are voting and feel like that those in the streets drawing attention to problems aren't reflective of American society as a whole. In some ways, we see a reiteration of this here in the summer of 2020, right, with the Black Lives Matter movement and public support for there, and the way that was capitalized on with both political campaigns and candidates in our presidential election. So there's a lot of parallels that I think are worth considering as you learn about this era and apply it to our current times. Now, his policy on Vietnam ends up being Vietnamization, to Vietnamize the Vietnam War, right? And this is part of the broader Nixon Doctrine. Go back, right? Our guns, our money, our tanks, not our troops, right? Vietnamization is the same thing, right? Nixon makes it a concerted effort to invest in the South Vietnamese to fight their own war, right? To expand their army, to equip their army, to train their army, so that the U.S. Army, the U.S. military forces who were in Vietnam can leave. However, behind the scenes, Nixon expands the conflict in what becomes known as the secret war. Nixon is incredibly, and American officials as a whole are incredibly upset with the continued flow of resources south, from North Vietnamese to the South Vietnamese, that are fighting the war: guns, soldiers, resources, food, etc. And much of this is coming through neighboring countries of Laos and Cambodia. So what Nixon does without authorization is he expands the conflict by bombing Laos, by bombing Cambodia, and later by actually invading Laos, like Cambodia, Laos, and using a newish technology called Agent Orange. Agent Orange, which is a terrible cancer-causing chemical defoliant, meaning it's dropped on trees and it ruins all the trees' leaves. It takes all the foliage off. Trying to do so to expose, like, where are the secret trails that are being used by the North Vietnamese to supply the South Vietnamese? This idea of like this secret war going on that needs to be exposed by chemical defoliant. Now, during Nixon's administration, we see a significant amount of conflict over Vietnam. Not that's his fault necessarily, but a lot of like the underlying issues that were taking place in Vietnam kind of come to a head and get exposed during his presidency. The first is the My Lai Massacre. The My Lai Massacre actually takes place in 1968, before Nixon is president. American soldiers are on what are called search and destroy missions for communist troops in the My Lai village. In 1968, while looking for communist soldiers, several soldiers begin to burn and destroy the existing village huts, assaulting and raping women and children, and end up executing, killing on site over 400 people that just live in this village. And it's part of the broader trends of the Vietnam War, of the soldiers having such a hard time understanding who they're fighting, right? Because you're fighting this guerrilla warfare. You might be fighting at night the guy that you walked by in the morning and waved, right, while in the village, because it's not a formalized war effort, and it goes to demonstrate some of the psyche problems of the U.S. Army. Not to excuse it, it's absolutely inexcusable. And the massacre might have been worse if not for a helicopter crew that sees what's happening and stops the soldiers, and then later actually exposes to authorities what actually took place there in My Lai. The U.S. military tried to cover it up. It was exposed 1 year later and led to the court-martialing and putting in jail of the leaders of this massacre. And one of the more embarrassing examples of U.S. conduct in the Cold War, and the kind of thing that really hurts public support, public opinion for the war effort. Now, just 1 year later, things get worse at home, right? So ask you in your notes the question, what reasons, events, and developments lead to increasing opposition to the Vietnam War, My Lai being one of them. Kent State University is another one. The U.S. has invaded Cambodia without permission, without publicizing this. Again, Cambodia is next to Vietnam, and they're trying to fight this broader war in Southeast Asia. When it becomes public they've invaded Cambodia, unrest blows up all over the country, right? The anti-war movement is very upset because Nixon had promised an end to the Cold War, right? Peace with honor. Now here we are expanding the Vietnam War to neighboring countries. A protest at Kent State University on a college campus goes very, very wrong, as the National Guard for the state of Ohio fires on the protesters, killing 4 students, wounding 9 students. And it's just a traumatic event in which these students are expressing their First Amendment rights, protesting. The National Guard is not necessarily in danger, and they instead kill 4, wound 9 protesters there at Kent State. I'll send you a link this week to a really good song written about this called Ohio. So make sure you stay tuned for that. I would play it here on this video, but then the video will get taken down from YouTube for copyright violation. I've learned this lesson before. Now, President Nixon responds to this killing of students here in America, right, on our soil, in a college campus, with indifference by saying, like, well, yeah, maybe they shouldn't have been protested. The majority of Americans as a whole blame the students, right, and asked who's responsible for the Kent State massacre. The students are responsible. So it just goes to show that silent majority is in fact the majority. The people in America that are pissed off about all the protests and the unrest and the change, they are in the majority at this point. They weren't in 1964, but here in 1970 they are. And this single event certainly helps us illuminate the turmoil in America, right? The problems in America over Vietnam, right? Pro and anti-Vietnam perspective, but also on like the youth-based counterculture versus the more established conservative society as well. So the Kent State University shooting is a terrible example of what went wrong, right, in Vietnam more broadly, but also in the domestic push against the Vietnam War. 1 year later, things get somewhat worse regarding Vietnam, and that is with the publishing of the Pentagon Papers in 1971. The Pentagon Papers are published, even though the government tries to keep them from being published by suing to keep these secret government documents from being put into newspapers. Because what these papers prove, and it's a fascinating read if you ever have an extra 4 weeks on your hands, and you want to kill time, I can give you a copy of them. But what these Pentagon Papers prove is that, according to secret government documents that have been being discussed, like between President Johnson and his advisors and the CIA, that Johnson lied. Johnson didn't just lie to Congress. Johnson lied to the American public. That President Johnson consistently lied on the Vietnam War to get funding, to say it's almost over. Right? He consistently downplayed negative elements of the war to sell the war effort to the American people. And in the court case, New York Times versus the United States, very important court case for freedom of the press in our country, Nixon and his administration tried to stop the publishing of the papers. They knew it would be bad for public opinion, support for the government. But the Supreme Court ruled in favor of publishing them, arguing that the government's job, if you're going to stop a publication, is to prove that that publication creates grave and irreparable danger to the country's safety. And in this case, it did not. So the Pentagon Papers, again, it's just a big ding on US support for the Vietnam War that was already declining, and declined for support of letting the president kind of do whatever the hell they want on foreign policy, right? So Cambodia, Laos, the expansion of bombing, the Pentagon Papers, the My Lai massacre, all those are examples of reasons why the Vietnam War gets less popular, and reasons why Congress acts to limit the president's authority to conduct warfare without oversight. Now, really, since World War II, as you guys know, right, it's Congress's job to declare war. It's the president's job to conduct war, right, to direct the war effort. But after World War II, we never declared war. We didn't declare war in Korea. We didn't declare war in Vietnam. We didn't declare war in Iraq and Afghanistan. No congressional war was declared. It was more so just military action that's kind of like war, but not fully. So after World War II, between Korea, which we engaged in more of a United Nations war effort, the Gulf of Tonkin resolution of Vietnam, which was discussed in the reading last chapter, the bombing of Cambodia, it appears as if we've not just one president, but presidencies as a whole, right, from Truman on, have kind of been able to do whatever the hell they want on the Cold War without any oversight, without any regulations or somebody watching the president to make sure they were not going rogue. So there's this perception that Congress has consistently deferred to the president on military issues, which is true. So Congress acts actually to restrict this, to take their power back, take back their power to be the branch that declares war by passing the War Powers Act, War Powers Resolution of 1973. Now, under this new restriction, which really is just going back to the way things used to be, the president could only order troops into combat if there was a congressional declaration of war. That's one. Right? If Congress declares war, then the president can send troops to combat. Or if there was statutory authorization or national emergency via the attack of American interests. Right? So it limits who and what the president can do warfare-wise. Additionally, it forces the president to notify Congress within 48 hours If they send troops to go do X, Y, and Z, right, to go to today, man, bomb Syria or do this in the Middle East or this elsewhere, they have to tell Congress in 48 hours. And armed forces are only allowed to be somewhere for 60 days with a 30-day withdrawal period unless Congress approves of it. So what it does is it just limits the president's ability to conduct military operations without oversight, without restraint. Nixon vetoes it. Congress overrides the veto with their 2/3 supermajority, which is a pretty big deal. And this cartoon kind of does the telling of it for us, right? The newspaper says War Powers Bill is passed, and Nixon's caption says, "Imagine Congress trying to curb my right to conduct unconstitutional wars. Why? That's unconstitutional." Right? Point of this argument that all Congress is doing here is trying to revert back to the actual constitutional method of ensuring that Congress, the people's house, or the people's branch, the legislative branch, has the power to decide when and where to send American troops. Now, on Vietnam, after much negotiation and more bombing and less bombing and then more bombing, the US, the North Vietnamese, and the South Vietnamese agreed to a peace accord in 1973 in Paris, called the Paris Peace Accords. In negotiation, what's decided is that America will take its forces out. America will just leave South Vietnam. We're gone. In exchange, America gets back their prisoners of war who have been held in captivity in Hanoi, the capital of North Vietnam, since the war began. The idea is that the country would stay divided, the US would bounce, and that's kind of how it would stay. We'll see what happens. But 2 years later, under Ford's administration, the North Vietnamese attack the South Vietnamese, creating a unified communist country, and America just says, sorry, we tried, y'all are on your own. And that really is the biggest embarrassment in American military effort in America's history as America, who helped win World War II and World War I, kind of, right? And all these other examples of conflict lost in Vietnam, and allowed communism to expand to Vietnam as a whole. Now, it's important domestically that you reference our live session for the notes. There's a whole bunch more there. Reference your text. But Nixon promises, when running for office, to be a moderate, to keep some of the Great Society programs in place. But as I told you in the live session, Nixon's approach is called New Federalism. New Federalism is really important in helping us understand kind of the long trend towards America ignoring social problems at the national and state level. And New Federalism is one of the ways in which we get that direction. A New Federalism is going to mostly say social problems, right? Problems of poverty, problems of living conditions, problems of unrest. Those problems are state problems to solve and local problems to solve, not national problems to solve. So states figure it out for yourself, right? Transferring some federal powers back to the states, right? So saying that segregation or desegregation, that'll be a state decision, right? And so of course, the states that had perpetuated Jim Crow style systems since the 1870s aren't going to be active on desegregating society because they hadn't been for 100 years. Even policies that are passed that would support civil rights during the 1970s are vetoed by Nixon. And Nixon also reshapes the Supreme Court because 4 justices retire on his watch. So he gets to pick 4 Supreme Court justices who all embrace a much more conservative approach, which leads Nixon's legacy into the next 2 decades. Now, in 1972, Nixon runs for re-election. He is portraying the Republicans again as the party of law and order. He casts his Democratic candidate, George McGovern, as an outsider who supports the 3 A's: acid, abortion, and amnesty. Acid, abortion, and amnesty. And it works. Nixon wins the fourth largest margin of victory in American presidential history. America has come around to really embrace like this law and order, anti-change, anti-drug, anti-counterculture, anti-new left approach. But within a year and a half, Nixon's resigned the presidency in shame and has walked out of the White House for the last time. What's important, though, in 1972 is Nixon employs what's called the Southern strategy. The Southern strategy. And as we know, we've talked about this in this class for months, right? Southern rural white people have mostly voted Democrat, right, since the Democratic Party was the party of antebellum slavery, right? During Reconstruction, Southern white people were mostly Democrat, right? Jim Crow, Democrat. Like throughout, so mostly Democrat. The Southern strategy is approached by the Republican Party, championed by Nixon and his advisors, to start attracting white voters who are upset with racial equality, who are pissed off about integration, who are anti-desegregation, who are anti-busing, right? This idea of forcing schools to integrate, and who are anti-fair housing and Voting Rights Act, et cetera. So what Nixon's going to do is oppose the extension of the Voting Rights Act there in 1972 to slow desegregation of federal housing, right? To work to grind to a halt some of the racial progress that is happening, and then to use coded language, right? Like law and order, like crime in cities, to use coded language to attract voters who might have been Southern Democrats who now are more attracted to the Republican message because of these issues of race, okay? This is what the election looks like. As we can see, Nixon wins in an absolute landslide. Poor McGovern doesn't get very far. George Wallace runs again for election here, although he is shot in an assassination attempt while running for president in 1972. Not that he deserves it, but now in Nixon's second term, we see some problems though. We see a big economic downturn as American products are in smaller demand because of our consistent investment in Western Germany, because of the Marshall Plan, and Japan because of World War II. So Western Germany and Japan are two countries that we didn't have to really compete with before because they were rebuilding from World War II. That's no longer the case. And American manufacturing begins to decline. This is when we really see an acceleration of what I called the Rust Belt a couple weeks ago. Additionally, America has significant inflation in the economy because America has been spending so much money on Vietnam, the Cold War more broadly, and the Great Society programs. Now the dollar worth is limited, costs are up significantly, and this creates an economic problem called stagflation. This is a problem which inflation's going up, so things are getting more expensive, but the economy's going down, so people have less money. This terrible economic condition that's caused by a variety of forces that I wish I had more time to explain. You can come by next year when we're back face to face, and I'll get on the whiteboard and give you some stagflation explanations if you're really curious. Heating up this problem is the OPEC oil embargo. You might remember the Organization of Petroleum Exporting Countries, formed in reaction to events with the Suez Canal crisis back in the 1950s with Eisenhower. Now, the US supports Israel during the Yom Kippur War in 1973. So all the other countries in the Middle East that are anti-Israel at the time embargo the US of oil. So you want to support Israel, that's fine. You just can't get any oil from us. The price of oil in the US quadruples. Gas prices go up by nearly 50%. And there begins to be gas lines. People can only get gas on certain days, depending on the last number of your license plate. It's crazy. The US, Nixon attempts to fix some of these economic problems by putting in place a price and wage control, by suspending the US dollar's reliance on gold, by putting a new tariff in place and import surcharge of 10%. But the economy begins to crumble in Nixon's administration. It only gets worse after he leaves the presidency. Now, 1973 is also a key year for Nixon scandals. His vice president, Spiro Agnew, is investigated by the FBI for taking bribes while vice president, but also previously while serving in politics in Maryland. The vice president is told either resign your office and take these lesser charges, or we're going to charge you with these much heavier crimes that have jail sentence. The vice president has to resign because of bribery charges. He's replaced by Gerald Ford, who's appointed from Congress. And while all this is happening secretly, the president's also under investigation for authorizing and supporting a bunch of political corruption that's going to eventually lead to Nixon resigning as well. So Nixon is by nature a very paranoid person. He's very worried that there's leaks in the White House, that people are sharing the secrets of his administration and his campaign in 1972. Formed as the committee to re-elect the president, called CREEP. Two individuals, one of whom just died last week. He went to jail for this. G. Gordon Liddy and E. Howard Hunt become known as the White House plumbers because their job is to stop leaks, to stop information from getting out. And Nixon's so paranoid about the election that some of his advisors are kind of given a green light do whatever they want to get him reelected. Now, some of his people break into the Democratic National Headquarters, where the whole Democratic Party apparatus is operating from the election, at the Watergate Hotel in 1972 in June. At do some math here, 5 months before the election. Now, they are found. They are just seen as some random burglars. There's no connection made to the Nixon administration. But over time, the press, led by these two individuals from the Washington Post, Bob Woodward and Carl Bernstein, begin slowly piecing together, right, by following the money. Who paid these guys to do this break-in? Who paid for them to get out of jail? By piecing it together, they traced this scandal back to the very top of the Nixon administration. And then eventually Congress has to appoint, the Justice Department has to appoint a special investigator to investigate what the heck happened. Nixon is asked to provide the tapes from the White House in which he's on tape discussing this, but a bunch of the tape is missing. When it becomes very clear he's going to have to give up the secret information that he has, he starts firing people in the Justice Department who were compelling him to do it in what's called the Saturday Night Massacre. He gets on TV and famously says, the American people deserve to know if their president is a crook. I am not a crook. He's lying. He is, in fact, a crook. In the Supreme Court, the Justice Department goes to the Supreme Court to decide, like, does he have to give up this information? The U.S. v. Nixon ruled that no, Nixon didn't have the authority to just keep information from Congress and the Justice Department and this independent investigation. So on the verge of being impeached, and he very, 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 nothing's for certain, but very, very, very likely would have been the first president removed from office, not just impeached, right? Andrew Johnson was impeached during Reconstruction. Clinton was impeached. Donald Trump was impeached twice. Check him out. Make America great again. Instead of dealing with impeachment, Nixon just bounces. Nixon resigns. Nixon says, I am out. I don't want to deal with that. Here is his resignation letter is very, very eloquent and well stated. Nice, thorough letter he wrote here to the Secretary. I hereby resign the office of the President of the United States. I am out. All right, Ford, his vice president, takes over. You should remember that Ford was only vice president because the vice president had resigned. Right, so he's the only person in presidential history who's elected, who becomes president despite ever being on a presidential ticket to get there. He wasn't president or vice president. He just got put as a vice presidency, and then he becomes president. Now here's a picture of Nixon leaving. He's all proud of himself, living it up. I'm not a crook. He is, in fact, a crook. So this kind of ends up like as not the final straw, but just another example of lost trust in government. The Watergate scandal erodes public trust in their own government. It helps illuminate all the problems in particular of why the U.S. is disillusioned, is not nearly as proud to be the U.S. as they were before. There's growing tension with the president and Congress, which can't solve these problems. There's discontent of the 1960s and 70s that reveals really an America that is at war with itself. America is at war between the forces of change and the forces of conservatism, the new left and the new right, like a pro-aggressive Cold War policy and not so, civil rights and no civil rights. Right? The violence in the streets throughout the 60s culminates here in 1968, and Nixon, and then even Nixon, who's supposed to be this fixer of American politics, is corrupt as all hell and has to resign. And this helps us define the 70s politically as a whole. This math equation of Watergate, this break into the Watergate Hotel, the president then helped cover up. We can just add in there too the Spiro Agnew resignation. People forget about that because like the president resigning kind of overshadows the fact that, oh wait, the vice president actually resigned a little bit ago too. The Watergate, the Pentagon Papers that exposed the line with the Vietnam War, the economy being just trash, the U.S. global status decreasing because of loss in the Vietnam War and elsewhere, leads to this big mistrust in America and disillusionment as well. Now, real quick, Ford as president, Ford, of course, takes office after Nixon resigns. He's seen as an honest man for the reasons he's put in that position in the first place to help America move past Watergate. But the first thing he does is he grants a full pardon to Nixon, a full example of presidential forgiveness, so he can't be charged with any of these crimes. He sees this as a desire to move America past Watergate, but it ends up causing a lot of outrage as Americans want their president to be held accountable for what he did. He deals with a terrible economy because of stagflation, recession and inflation at the same time. As stagflation, it's a rough rough go. He tries to fix the inflation problem by calling for a tighter money supply, I mean, like less money being loaned to fix the inflation problem, but that doesn't work. With his whip inflation now, it is not nearly enough to actually slow the inflation. The problems with OPEC, that petroleum exporting countries organization, gets worse. There's a huge oil crisis in Ford's first few months as president. Check out these gas lines, these cars all in line trying to get gas before the gas station runs out for the day. He does, however, attend the Helsinki Accords, which is cool, as that's another meeting in Europe to try to lessen Cold War tension, which furthers détente. But under him, not that it's his fault, Saigon, the capital of South Vietnam, falls, and Vietnam gets unified under communist rule. So 1976 comes, and Jimmy Carter runs for president as a Democrat. He is a political outsider, which is seen as a plus at the time because Americans are real tired of political politicians doing what they see now as like corrupt, normal political things, like Nixon, right? Like Ford pardoning Nixon. They see it as a kind of insider trading. So Carter wins in a very, very, very close election over Gerald Ford, running for president after serving as president after Nixon resigned. And Carter has a rough go. Carter is a lovely man, a great man who still to this day, he's old, he's alive, spends his time helping build homes for people in underdeveloped countries for Habitats for Humanity. Good man, rough go as a president. He runs as an outsider because he's not involved in any of the problems of the 60s and 70s, right? No involvement in Vietnam, no involvement in Watergate, no involvement in the recession. And even so, it's a very close election. He tries to fix the three big problems: the energy crisis with oil, stagflation in the economy, and the recession, and nothing works. It's not his fault necessarily, but the tools he's using at his disposal are insufficient to deal with the problems of the American economy at the time. Inflation hits 14%, which is crazy. Interest rates hit 20% nearly, which is unbelievable. Meaning you're paying 20% of the money you're borrowing just to borrow money, which means nobody borrows money because money's too expensive to borrow. And there's the new embargo in 1979, which makes gas prices go up even further. Under him, it's not his fault, but under him, the Supreme Court, this is one of the legacies of Nixon's conservative appointments, right? It's conservative appointments that are going to then make conservative rulings for the next 20 years in the Supreme Court. Backey versus the University of California Regent System is going to actually rule that race cannot be the reason for college admission as a real hit to affirmative action. It upholds affirmative action. It says like race can be an example of why you get into college, but can't be the example. And thus affirmative action as a system to try to uphold minorities into places in which they didn't have access before ends up being portrayed in public as an unfair advantage to minorities instead of what it's intended to do, which is an attempt to level the playing field. As the U.S. tries to pivot away from oil, because all these oil problems that we're having, right, with the embargoes, the U.S. is trying to invest in more nuclear power instead to power our economy. A giant nuclear plant explodes at 3 Mile Island, causing all kinds of nuclear fallout and radiation, which then leads to questioning using atomic power. So as we can see, it's just a rough go for Carter. This then leads to an increase actually in the green movement, which we still see today. There's debate over the Green New Deal, right? And an all-electric, all-solar type of country, which only gets further benefited by the oil embargoes and these nuclear plants exploding. It's not fun. Now, in foreign policy, maybe it's arguably worse. For Carter, he, much like Woodrow Wilson in the 1910, advocates more of a human rights approach, right? Moral diplomacy of Wilson, Carter's human rights approach. Carter attempts to stop supporting foreign governments, that violate human rights. I talked a lot earlier in this unit about the Cold War theme of anybody who's an enemy of communism is good for the U.S. But Carter wants to pivot away from that and instead support only administrations that support human rights elsewhere, which is the right idea in theory. One of his big successes on foreign policy here at the end of the 70s is called the Camp David Accords. He brings the Egyptian leader and the Israeli leader that Egypt-Israel issues ever since Israel's formation after World War II. The Camp David Accords begins working with both of those parties towards peace in the Middle East. But then things get way, way, way worse. The Islamic Iranian cleric Ayatollah Khomeini leads an Iranian revolution. If you may remember, back to for the Eisenhower Doctrine, excuse me, the U.S. authorizes the overthrow of Iranian government and puts in place a Shah who's loyal to the U.S. Well, that was 20 some years ago, and now it's beginning to backfire, like I told you that it would. Right, this Shah, this leader of Iran, who's been so like anti-communist, but then because of that kind of totalitarianly anti-communist, has now been overthrown by an Islamic revolution, an extremist Islamic revolution. They overthrow the pro-U.S. leader, the Shah, and they instate instead a radical regime, a theocratic, so religion-based, a radical Islamic regime in Iran that hates the U.S. Right? As part of this overthrow, they storm the American embassy, the U.S. like diplomatic center in Iran, and they hold 52 Americans hostage. Here, there's a picture of them. 52 Americans are held hostage in Iran for over 100 years, for 444 days, and what becomes known as the Iranian hostage crisis. Carter tries everything to get these guys back. Diplomacy, negotiation, none of it works. Tries even some crazy attempts to rescue them with covert operations that don't work. And it just ends up making Carter look incredibly weak. He can't fix the economy. He can't get our hostages back from Iran. What can he do? The American people are asking. As all this is happening, the Soviet Union looks at this and says, man, the US is a mess right now. You know what we should do? Take advantage of them being a mess and expand the Cold War. Let's take advantage of their chaos and do something good for us. Doing so, the Soviet Union invades Afghanistan. It signals that détente, this cooling down period, is ending. Things are heating back up. And again, shows the US weakness, as the US is, because of preoccupation elsewhere, unable to like legitimately push back on Soviet expansion to Afghanistan. What the US does instead is arm some people to fight against Soviet expansion who might actually end up backfiring on us later, but I'll say that another time. So obviously Carter's presidency is a bust. 1980, Ronald Reagan as the Republican runs against Carter, and as you can see, it is a landslide victory for Ronald Reagan. Ronald Reagan promises this strong conservative presidency that's going to be tough on communism and tough on crime and tough on drugs and tough on unrest. And he asked the people in a very famous debate, he asked the American people, are you better now than you were 4 years ago? And the American people in general can say no. And if that's the answer, then it's very unlikely the president gets reelected. So that does it for the 1970s. We will hit the ground running next week with Reagan's 1980s, a fascinating time and a very important time in understanding our political, social, and economic climate of today. Have a great rest of your day. I love you all, and I will talk to you soon.